Hi everyone and welcome to part 2 of the Void Dragon tutorial. Last time we took a look at mainly the metal parts of the model, so the body, the wings, the crown or headdress, whatever you want to call it. We did some nice airbrushing on the body and we looked at using contrasting colours rather than necessarily light and dark to highlight and shade with, a nice bluey green and a purple. And then also making sure we tried to time into our previous Necron project, so using the same recipes for certain metals on there. So in this second part of the video we're going to focus on the two other main areas of this kit, which is the Blackstone, the fragments of the Blackstone, Noctilith I think they call it, and the energy coils or beams, whatever they are, that's suspending this pretty funky looking model. To begin with, I'm going to airbrush the rocks with GW Incubi Darkness. This is thinned 50/50 with airbrush thinner and I'm spraying at 20 psi. I had a long think about whether I wanted to airbrush the rocks or whether I wanted to airbrush the energy coils. It'd be a lot easier to airbrush the energy coils a light colour and then paint the rocks in with a darker colour. It will cover easier. But the way the model was laid out and how many of these energy coils and things were around the main body of the model, I knew I was going to be going in with my paintbrush quite a lot to pick them out anyway in the detail areas. So I chose to do it this way around. I've just got a couple of smooth coats straight over the black. To further reinforce the colour, I'm going to dry brush on Incubi Darkness as well. You can always paint over or dry brush over with the same paint that you've airbrushed with and it will give you a stronger, more opaque finish. This is just because you're generally putting it on in a thicker layer than you can with the airbrush. Could have achieved a similar result stippling on the colour with my dry brush as well. As I said, the dry brush and the airbrush are pretty interchangeable on this project. Now I'm going to highlight the rocks a little bit, so I've added a little bit of a Vallejo model colour pale grey blue into my Incubi mix, and then just as I've done with an airbrush where I've picked the direction for the light to come from, I'm only going to highlight with the dry brush from that direction, so above in this case. So I'm catching all those edges that are facing upwards. If you just want to see, all I'm doing is mixing the two colours together here on a piece of kitchen paper. Just getting a little lighter. I'm going to do all these demos on this small piece here rather than the whole model. I'm not going to lie to you, it's quite a challenge getting him to stay still whilst you're doing all of this. Particularly if you're going to film it. So I've added a little bit more of the lighter colour in here. We're going to do another highlight. And one of the things you'll often find with dry brushing, no matter how well you do it, no matter how moist you keep the brush and whatnot, it has a particular finish. Some people call it a bit chalky, a bit dusty, whatever you want to call it. It has a recognisable finish. That doesn't mean it's not a fantastic technique. One thing we can do to mitigate that finish a little is to use a very thin glaze of a colour over the top of it, just to sort of knock it back and give us a more uniform finish on the rest of the model. So in this case I've used very, very thin down Despair Green, which if you remember was a colour that we used on the main model as well. So we're just tying the model into the base there. Now for the energy coils themselves, I wanted a nice bright green. I know it's very standard Necron sort of colour, but I think it's really cool. This colour is called Escorpena Green. It's a Vallejo game colour, and I was going to use GW Moot Green for this, and Andy said to me, goes, oh, why don't you try Escorpena Green? It's pretty much the same colour, but it's got much, much better coverage. So I thought I'd give it a go, and he was right, unsurprisingly. I've diluted it ever so slightly, and I'm just getting it painted on there. Now this is the second coat going on and you can see how well it's covering, and that was almost over black. You know, it had a little bit of the overspray of the Incubi Darkness on there. It's pretty much going over black here, and in the end for most of it I did 3 layers. It's by far and away the most time consuming part of this model. It's not much fun if I'm honest with you, but the end result is worth it. Now I've took some GW Warp Lightning contrast paint, popped it in my airbrush, and I'm just going to hit the shadows or the underside basically, of all the energy coils. I'm also not worrying if I get a tiny bit of overspray onto the rocks here. We've used so much green and turquoise and the rest of it, it just won't even show up. We're not looking at anything to do with OSL right now. This is just looking to shade those energy coils. Already starting to look really nice. To highlight, I'm going to do a little bit of dry brushing with some white. Again, the reason I've chosen to dry brush here rather than airbrush is to create a different type of highlight. I want to be able to be really specific with where I'm putting it. I'm going to do a little bit of white on the rock as well, because we are going to do some OSL or some object source lighting. So just building up a nice bright layer of white, and we're obviously getting a little bit of blending into the green anyway in the manner in which we're painting. And now I'm using the new Games Workshop Tesseract Glow technical paint. This is very, very similar to a fluorescent ink. It is fantastic for this. You can see it going over here. We're getting this lovely glowing green colour. And where I've sprayed over the rock there, you can see it's just giving us this nice OSL effect. It's a very quick and dirty way of doing it. For the blades, so the tail of the weird little scorpion dude that's ready to shiv the C'Tan in the back, and for the blade on the C'Tan itself, I've chosen to brush paint the energy weapons on here. I don't really like airbrushed power weapons. I don't like the look of them. And also, I've used the airbrush so much on this model, I don't want it to look like an airbrushed model. I want it to just look like a cool model. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to do some brush painting, to show some paint strokes, just so the model becomes more interesting and not just a one-trick pony. If you'd like to watch our video on blending and creating power weapon schemes, I'll link it in the top. But that's all I'm doing here, just adding layers of Escorpena Green into my Incubi Darkness and just building it up. And once I've got sort of a mid-tone and a highlight, I'll then use Incubi Darkness to glaze it back and knock it back, which you can see that I've done here. As I said, just follow the video on that. It's a nice simple process. Just to show you, I'm just started doing it on the C'Tan spear here as well. So I need to do a little bit more glazing there to blend those colours together. But I think this kind of detail's nice, particularly on a centrepiece model. As I said, it's nice to show some techniques, but also create an overall interesting looking model. Just zoomed in here, I was doing the glow part on the energy weapons up near the model. You see a little bit of foam forming at the front of my airbrush. I'd clean my airbrush, and because these Harder & Steenbeck Signature Series brushes that we've got are a screw fit at the end and they're a threadless nozzle, if you don't tighten the end right up, you'll get a tiny little air leak like that, which will just force any of the liquid out. So if you're wondering why that's happening, you just need to tighten it up and you're fine. So here I am just picking out the energy coils, just like we did a minute ago on the piece, the practice piece with the rock. And I'm very, very carefully working on the pieces around his face. I don't just want to splash this Tesseract Glow all over the place and just cake the whole model in it. It'll look awful. So I'm taking my time. I said before it behaves an awful lot like an ink. I don't need to thin it in the airbrush, so all I've done is add a little flow aid just to ensure I didn't have any issues with it beading or anything like that on the model. I decided to go for a sort of weird green glowy rune thing in the middle of his face as well. I was going to do it gloss black originally, but actually it wasn't very nicely balanced across the model, so it needed some just in the middle. Then a couple of little glazes over the weapon and just up the haft of it. Not too much, just to give us that overall glowing effect. I actually think it's come together really, really nicely. I won't lie, I struggled a bit when I was painting the energy coils. I was like, oh god, this is going to ruin the model. But I'm really pleased with how it's come together. I'm going to go in with my brush and just pick out a couple more areas just to push home that glowing effect. So I've done a little bit on the rune in the middle of his face, and I'm going to do a little bit on the edges of the rocks that are right next to where the energy coils are, leaving them or contacting them, whatever it is they're doing. Similar to how I've done on those pieces of Blackstone that are inset into his wings. And once I'm happy with where they are, I'll just glaze over those again with the Tesseract Glow. I used pale blue-grey for that, to do the edge highlighting. You could use white, whatever. It just had the pale blue-grey on my palette. And here he is. So you can see, for quite a complex model, a very complex model at first glance anyway, and a centerpiece model, when we break him down into his component parts, there wasn't actually that much to him. Yes, it required a little bit of ability with the airbrush, but not tons. You know, we didn't have to ever make sure we had a really sharp blend that was a significant change in direction or anything like that. We didn't need to do any masking. A lot of it was just down to considering the paints we were going to use, considering the colours and how they'd work together to make a harmonious looking model. It's a very clever kit. I've got to applaud them for that, the way it's suspended and this cool effect they've got of him floating along on all this energy. It does make it challenging to paint, but you can see the sub-assemblies I effectively painted in him. In the last video, I told you how I used the wings to hold him with rather than pin him on anything. And then for the base, as soon as I'd painted that small piece that I've used in the demo earlier in this video, just glued all the rest of it together. And then we glued him on towards the very end and just used exactly the same techniques, a little bit of dry brushing, a little bit of glazing with the green to tie in any of the rocks where we wanted them. So I'd suggest putting aside a few evenings to get him done, but he's a very, very achievable centerpiece model. I hope you've enjoyed this two-part series, and if you have, let us know. Let us know what you'd like to see in the future. If you've enjoyed the video, hit the like button. If you've really enjoyed it, then hit subscribe. It helps us out a lot. And I'll see you next time.